Blending with acrylics is hard, but it doesn't have to be. And I know this because I have made blending mistakes over and over and over again, just like you. So if you would like to learn how to stop your acrylic paints from drying out, how to get a smooth, realistic looking blend without muddy colors, and how to stop streaky blending and drips in their tracks, then this challenge is for you. Whether blending a gradient for a sky, soft, fuzzy clouds, or a small, hazy sun, we use the same few tools, techniques, and methods to get that soft, blended look. The best way to get better at something, hands down, is to practice, practice, practice. The more we practice blending, the more we start to get a feel for our medium and our tools. Not only that, but we start to commit what we're learning to long-term memory and to our muscle memory. As painters, our tools are an extension of our own bodies. And just like walking and driving soon became second nature to us, so will blending the more you practice. This entire challenge is designed around that practice makes perfect principle. We're going to talk about techniques and do a short demonstration, followed by exercises that you're going to follow along with me for, practicing those techniques, committing them to long-term memory, and really getting a feel for the techniques in a non-committal way. After that, we'll apply the exercise techniques that we've done to 4-part series of paintings in these juicy colors. We'll paint ourselves some lovely summery seascapes. The question I get asked more than any other is, how do I stop my paints from drying out? Keeping your paint wet enough on your substrate, whether that's a canvas, paper, wood, or a rock, is really important when blending. Your paint can dry out on your palette, and it can also dry out on your canvas or on your paper. And if you're someone that paints with paper, you know your paint dries 10 times faster on paper than it does with canvas. That's actually because your canvas holds a great deal of water, whereas your paper doesn't. And think about it this way. You spilled some water on a table, try wiping it up with some canvas fabric, and now try wiping it up with paper. Of course, the canvas fabric is a lot more absorbent. My first tip is to work faster. When we're painting, we want to relax, but when we're doing blending, especially wet on wet blending, we need to try to work a little bit faster than normal. So relax, but relax quickly. I keep my paints wet using this regular mister bottle from the hardware store, and you can get these at any kind of Home Depot shop. So you've got your palette next to you, you can just make sure it's on the mist setting. Give them a little spritz every so often to keep your paints nice and wet on the palette. You can also get something called a Stay Wet palette. These are palettes that are designed to hold water, and they'll keep your paints wet for days. However, the Stay Wet palettes are all quite small. I think the biggest one I saw was 9 by 12 inches, and I don't know about you, but I need a lot more room than that to spread out. So my favorite method for when I'm painting in really, really hot sun or wind is just to spritz my paints often with a water bottle. When we're doing wet on wet gradient blending, especially smoothing 2 colors together seamlessly for something like a sky, mist and water droplets are the absolute worst. Once you get a water droplet on your paint, even if you just let it sit there and dry out naturally, it pushes the pigment to the sides, it creates a white dot, and if you were to try to dab that with a paper towel, it would absolutely lift. If you happen to get a droplet on a gradient that you absolutely love, the key is to fix it right away. Do it while the background color is still wet and just smooth on another layer of paint. Another really simple way to keep the paint on your palette from drying out is simply to use more paint. I sometimes see people squeezing out these tiny little blobs to try and save their paint. However, the paint kind of acts, like a big bowl of water versus a little droplet. Put some hot sun on them, the little droplet of water evaporates quicker, whereas if you have a larger body of a wet substance, it stays wet longer. So I know you think you're saving paint by pouring out just a little bit, but try for me pouring quite a bit more than you think you need out on your palette. It will actually save you more paint in the long run. So try using for me a little bit more paint if you're someone whose paint dries out right on your palette. Sometimes our paints dry out because we have to leave our painting for a little while. You're painting with little kiddos running around, or you're busy, you work for a business, you've got to go take a business call. So if you leave your painting station, it's going to dry out. The Stay Wet palettes maybe aren't big enough for you. So what I always do is I take some cling paper, like see-through cling wrap, and I'll just put it over top of my palette, and that saves all of my mixed colors. Alternatively, you can mix your paint in little jars, and if I'm working on a really big painting like a mural or a large size canvas, and I need to save quite a bit of my mixed colors, then you can mix your paints in just little jars with screw tops and then keep your individual pots of color wet for longer. Your palette itself is going to be really important to keeping your paints wet longer. Never ever use anything absorbent like wood or paper or anything porous, because it's going to suck the moisture right out of your paints. One of the oldest palettes that artists have been using for decades is glass panels. So if you have an old, make sure it's really a thick glass, a thick window, you can use your glass. You can also use things like a glass cutting board, not the bumpy kind, but a nice smooth sheet of glass. So those will hold more water onto your palette than anything absorbent. One of my favorite things to use for a palette is freezer paper. Freezer paper is paper that's coated with a waxy substance. It comes in big rolls, the stuff you put in between food in your freezer to keep it from sticking together. It's quite cheap, and because it's paper, it actually biodegrades quite quickly. Perhaps the most important thing to keeping our paints wet enough to blend them together and to stay wet on our palette for a long time is consistency. You want to make sure your paint can glide easily from side to side on your substrate. Add water to your paint if you find it's too thick. Making sure you're using the right amount of water is absolutely one of the most important aspects of being able to blend well. You don't want to use too much, and you don't want to use too little, because each acrylic paint starts out at a different consistency. Some are heavy body, meaning they're thicker, and some are softer body, meaning they are thinner. Means that you need some personal experience to get the right feel for how much water to add to your paint. And the more you practice, the more you'll start to understand the desired consistency for getting really nice, smooth blends. If there is too much water in your paint, it means it will be thin, see-through, and streaky. An example of paint that is too thin is paint that is the consistency of soup or milk. If you don't have enough water in your paint, it will not glide smoothly over your substrate, and it will dry out quite quickly before you even get a chance to blend it together. An example of paint that is too thick is paint that's more the consistency of toothpaste or like a wall putty, and if you kind of pick up paint that's heavy body and pour it onto your palette, it will leave really stiff peaks. An example of paint that is just the right consistency is like pudding or soft yogurt, or like a really, really thick kind of gravy consistency. Another tip for getting really great blends is to build your paint up in layers. I know you might want to sit down and just bang out a painting in one go. However, we often need 2 or even more layers to our paintings to get that really, really rich, seamless, and soft look that we're going for. And don't be afraid of adding layers. A second layer always adds an element of depth and dimension to our projects. It's really important to make enough paint. You'll want to have enough paint that you can do 2 or more coats if you need to fix mistakes. And you never want to be stopping mid-blend because you don't have enough paint to continue on, because then the paint's going to dry out on your canvas. Adding Glazing Liquid, which is a slow dry medium, sometimes called an acrylic paint retarder, extends the life of the paint. It allows it to stay wet longer both on your palette and on your canvas, and it also allows them to be blended together like oils. It's important to note that whether you're using just water or a glazing medium, when you add these, they're both see-through. So the fluid retarder is a see-through acrylic polymer, and water is of course water. And when we add them to our paint, it adds clear substance to them, so it will make them thin. You don't want to add more than 50% of water or 50% of your glazing liquid, because it will make the paint so thin that they're once again becoming streaky. If you find that you're having to add so much water or slow drying medium to your paints that they're thin and they're still drying out on you, it's time to invest in slow drying paints. This is a slow drying paint. It is called Golden Open. It has the slow drying medium built right into it, but it has twice as much pigment, so this already has the medium built into it, and it will stay wet for a really, really, really long time. These paints are a bit of an investment, but you're going to find they're super rich and creamy, and you have to use very little of them, and they go a really long way. So if you love painting and you're using a lot of blends in your paint, get yourself some of these open style, get yourself some of these open style paints. If you can't shell out the big bucks to get a whole set of colors, we mix almost all of our colors with white when we're painting. It's the most used color. So if you invest in just a tube of white, you'll get the benefit of the slow dry paint and you can mix it in with your other colors. So this is a great investment to make. Having the right brushes as tools for blending is really important, as well as keeping that paint wet. Use the softest brush that you have. A big soft wash brush or a mop brush can lightly feather together gradient blends until they're so seamless they look like they're oil paints. Stiff bristles can actually gouge into your paint, creating a streaky look. Now, sometimes we want a streaky look, but that's not what we're going for when we want a smooth blend. Clean your brushes a lot. When we're creating a gradient, whenever we touch the light color or the dark color, we pick it up. And if we keep blending together, we're going to make a big mess of muddy colors. So it's really important to often clean our brushes and just use a clean, damp brush to hover over the area where our two colors meet to get that soft look of colors melting together. Make sure that your brush is always just damp, not soaking wet and dripping. Remember, we need to avoid drips and over-wetting our paint at all times. I like to keep either some paper towel or an old rag or a sponge nearby, and every time I clean my brush, which is often, you're going to tap it off on a napkin, making sure that brush is just a little bit damp, and that makes an excellent blending tool. Another thing that can affect our blending is pressure and motion. So let's talk about those things a little bit. In terms of motion, you can blend in circle patterns, gradients, side to side, or diagonals, even little circles. I want you to try all of them. They're all viable ways of blending. Get yourself a nice pad of paper or a canvas pad and practice blending quite often. Remember, experimentation is key to understanding our medium. With pressure, sometimes we need firmer pressure and sometimes we need just a soft, gentle dusting. If you've got two colors you're blending together on a canvas and they're not smooshing together, try a little bit more pressure and moving a little bit faster. That way you can meld them together quite quickly while they're still wet. If you've got a decent blend and you're just trying to, say, buff out some brush strokes, or there's just this seam where you want to soften a line, use a soft brush and some light pressure and just tickle the surface of your canvas, of your substrate where those two colors meet. The last thing I want to talk to you about is something that happens to all of us sometimes, and that is muddy colors. Muddy colors can happen for two reasons. One is that we're blending together complementary colors wet on wet. So if we're trying to blend purples and yellows together wet on wet, they'll turn into a brown color. If we're trying to blend red and green together wet on wet, they'll become like a brown muddy color. If we're trying to blend blue and orange together wet on wet, they will become muddy. But another source of muddy colors happens when we just mix and mix and mix and mix and mix, and we mix them so much that it all becomes one color. So if we're trying to get a soft transition, so this is kind of an orangish red and this is a purple. If I mix these two colors together wet on wet, they become a funky, grayish, kind of like weird cartoon flesh color. So in order to blend these two colors together, instead of wet on wet blending, we need to blend it together through layering. So try not to blend your colors together too much. Less is more. Try blending. If you're someone who's always mixing your colors so much that they just become one color, try to slow down, breathe, always stop for a minute and see what the paint is showing you instead of just getting in there and going kind of too quickly. So slow down if muddy colors are a thing for you. And when you're blending complementary colors together, we're going to blend in a different way called layering, which is a process of blending a wet color into a dry background. If you've never done that before, we're going to now get into the exercise portion of the Blending Blast Challenge, and we're going to practice some of these things we talked about. We've done a lot of words just now, and we learned the best from doing things. So let's go ahead and do some fun little exercises in our block of paper.